You ever been laughed at for choosing peace over power? That's exactly what happened to Marina. At the biggest corporate gala of the year, her ex-husband stood there, smirking, loud, full of pride, mocking the quiet life she built after their messy divorce. He thought he won. Thought she was alone. Thought her simple life made her weak. But what he didn't know was that the calm man standing next to her wasn't just anyone. He was the CEO of a rival firm. And with just one quiet phone call, he started the process of taking everything the ex-husband built. This isn't just a story of success. It's about the power of staying silent until the moment that silence becomes strength. So if you've ever felt small, ever walked away from something toxic, stay with us. This story's for you. Marina Lowell traced the rim of her porcelain teacup, the gentle steam warming her face in the peaceful calm of her studio. Outside, the sounds of downtown Portland stirred, distant sirens, the low hum of traffic, but inside there was only the soft scent of wet clay and fresh peonies. This was her so-called simple life, the one her ex-husband Preston Langford spoke of with such contempt. Simple, maybe, to a man whose world was a chaotic opera of quarterly reports, stockholder calls, and parading his latest acquisitions. But for Marina, it was real. It was hers. After the divorce, she had turned down the grand alimony, an offer more about easing Preston's guilt and preserving his public image than supporting her. Instead, she accepted a modest settlement, just enough to lease this sunlit loft and start Earth and Petal, a boutique studio where she crafted custom ceramics and designed floral installations for select clients. These weren't the industry giants Preston wined and dined. They were artists, old-money families who valued privacy and quiet appreciators of true beauty. It was a life defined by taste, not wealth. The ping of an incoming email disrupted the calm. She wiped her hands on her canvas apron and tapped her laptop. The subject line made her chest tighten. Invitation. The Langford Corporation Annual Shareholder Gala. It was Preston's yearly masterpiece of ego, a gathering where the city's business elite came together to flaunt checks, shake hands, and most importantly, be seen. This year's event would take place at the Delmore, a historic Portland venue with vaulted ceilings and marble columns, a place once built by a timber baron, now a monument to executive self-worship. It represented everything she had walked away from, a world obsessed with appearance and applause. She knew the invite wasn't about politeness. It was a challenge, a setup. Preston's chance to flaunt his new life, his corporate ascent, his new fiancée, Brielle Ashton, a model best known for her perfect Instagram poses and her skill in making him look good. He wanted Marina there to compare the old with the new, and feel small. A sigh slipped from her lips. Her first instinct was to delete the email and move on. But then something inside her sparked, quiet and defiant. Why should she hide? Her life wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. That evening, surrounded by the soft lamplight and warm concrete lines of Ethan Ward's minimalist downtown Seattle loft, Marina shared the story. Ethan listened in complete stillness. He was a man of quiet gravity, a sharp contrast to Preston's constant energy. Where Preston was loud, Ethan was composed. Where Preston demanded attention, Ethan effortlessly drew it. He was the CEO of a global software firm, one whose algorithms powered half the tech used in modern logistics, a name rarely in headlines, but deeply respected behind boardroom doors. They had met at a small gallery exhibit, introduced by a mutual friend over a shared admiration for a bronze sculptor's minimal forms. Their connection had grown slowly, organically, worlds apart from the media circus of her former marriage. "So he wants to put you on display," Ethan said, not asking, just stating it with clarity. He swirled the golden whiskey in his glass. "To show everyone how much better off he is, and how far you've fallen." "Basically," Marina said, tracing her fingertip along the weathered surface of the reclaimed oak table. "He'll have Brielle on his arm, glittering in diamonds he probably bought last week. They'll talk about their latest trip to Fiji and the new Gulf Stream. And I'll just be the ex-wife who now arranges flowers and plays with clay." Ethan set his glass down. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "There's more grace in one of your vases than in his entire fleet of jets, Marina. You know that." "I do," she whispered. "But it's at the Delmore. That was our place. He proposed to me there. Snow was falling through the glass roof." Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. He saw the flicker in her eyes, a memory she'd tried to bury. Preston hadn't picked that venue by coincidence. He chose it because it once mattered, because using it now for his display was an act of intentional cruelty. "Then you have to go," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Marina looked up, surprised. "Really? I thought you'd tell me to just ignore him." "Ignoring him lets him rewrite the story. He'll say you were too embarrassed to show your face." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "We'll go. We'll drink champagne. You'll be the most composed, luminous person in the room, and we'll leave whenever you're ready. You won't be there as Preston Langford's ex. You'll be Marina Lowell, with me." And just like that, her tension began to ease. With Ethan by her side, the Delmore didn't feel like a trap. He wasn't just wealthy, he was stable. He was power without spectacle. He was the man who truly saw her and stood by her. "Okay," she said, a real smile finally spreading across her face. "But just so you know, I'm wearing a dress I got from a consignment shop. A very, very good one, but still." Ethan's lips curved into a rare full smile. "Good. Let him be blinded by the sparkle, while we admire the substance." He rose and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, their panes framing a panorama of Seattle's glittering skyline. Quietly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed a short encrypted message to his chief of staff, Michael Tran, the man who handled his most sensitive matters. "Michael, I need a full portfolio on Langford Dynamics. Ownership structure, current financials, and any signs of acquisition interest. Also, confirm current market valuation. I need it by morning. Total discretion." He tucked the phone away and turned back to Marina, his expression unreadable. He had no intention of letting her walk into that gala vulnerable. Preston Langford wanted to flex his power, but Ethan Ward was about to redefine it. The night of the gala came, cloaked in a crisp autumn mist. A slow river of sleek black sedans inched their way toward the Delmore, dropping off Seattle's elite onto a crimson carpet lined with photographers. The air buzzed with the snap of cameras and the curated chaos of calculated fame. Marina felt a ripple of nerves as their car approached. She wore a vintage Halston gown in deep sapphire, its clean lines radiating quiet confidence, so different from the glittering, name-plastered creations Preston's new circle adored. Her only jewelry was a pair of understated diamond studs Ethan had given her. They caught the light, just enough to glint, just like Ethan himself. He, in turn, was the embodiment of quiet force. In a tailored navy suit, he moved with composure. The only overt clue to his status was the platinum Grobel 4C timepiece on his wrist, a watch so rare it could fund a startup twice. He hadn't dressed to impress. He simply was. Helping her out of the car, Ethan leaned in and murmured softly into her ear, "We're just here to watch the ecosystem, observe the wildlife in its natural habitat." Marina let out a soft laugh, her shoulders relaxing. Ethan had that way of grounding her, of pulling back the curtain on the spectacle and making it feel absurd, almost entertaining. They sidestepped the crowd and the press line. Ethan whispered to the security head, who immediately lifted the velvet rope for a quiet side entrance. A few camera flashes flickered behind them, confused, curious. No one quite knew who he was, but they could sense his weight. Inside, the Delmore was stunning. The glass dome arched high above, revealing stars through its polished panes. Giant crystal chandeliers lit the room with a cold sparkle, each one the size of a small car. A quartet played Vivaldi, their notes nearly drowned by the tide of whispered deals and manufactured charm. It didn't take long for Preston to find them. He cut through the room like a shark, Brielle anchored at his side. She wore a blazing red gown, bold and clingy, accented by a diamond necklace so large it resembled an elegant restraint. "Marina, I was starting to think you weren't going to show," Preston boomed, his voice soaked in exaggerated warmth. His gaze slid over her dress with a brief, dismissive glance, then shifted to Ethan. There was a flicker of calculation in his eyes. What he saw, a handsome, well-dressed man. What he didn't see, someone recognizable from the tech columns or investor roundtables. A nobody, Preston decided. "Preston," Marina said, her tone even. The invite was hard to ignore. "You know Brielle, of course." "Of course," Marina said with a nod. Brielle offered a smile, a practiced one that didn't quite reach her ice-bright eyes. "And this is—" Preston gestured vaguely at Ethan. "Ethan Ward," he said, extending his hand. His grip was steady, his stare calm. He said nothing more, no job title, no affiliation. It was intentional. In his world, if you had to explain who you were, you probably weren't that important. Preston interpreted the quiet as a lack of significance. "So what line of work are you in, Ethan?" he asked. "Finance," his default probe to estimate any man's worth in seconds. "In a way," Ethan said vaguely, his gaze drifting toward the ornate ceiling beams. "Stunning venue." Preston puffed his chest. "The Delmore's the best. Only the best for Langford Corp. We're set to smash all our fundraising numbers tonight. It's about growth, you know? Keep building. Always expanding." He shot the last line straight at Marina, a not-so-subtle jab at her scaled-back life. "Some things are perfect just as they are," she replied smoothly. "Growth isn't always about size. Sometimes it's about depth." Preston let out a short, mocking laugh. Spoken like a true boutique hobbyist, it landed like a slap. A hobby. He had just dismissed her business, her purpose, as a trivial pastime. Marina's face flushed, but before she could reply, Ethan's hand pressed gently against her back, a silent reassurance. "Preston, it's Mr. Vanderbrook," Brielle said suddenly, tugging on his sleeve and nodding toward a silver-haired mogul holding court nearby. "He wants to discuss the Tahoe expansion." Preston's head snapped around. Business and status eclipsed the satisfaction of tearing into his ex-wife. "Of course, excuse us." He offered them one last glance, half smug, half dismissive. "Try not to get sticker shock," he said, turning away. He cut through the room like a shark, Brielle anchored at his side. She wore a blazing red gown, bold and clingy, accented by a diamond necklace so large it resembled an elegant restraint. "Marina, I was starting to think you weren't going to show," Preston boomed, his voice soaked in exaggerated warmth. His gaze slid over her dress with a brief, dismissive glance, then shifted to Ethan. There was a flicker of calculation in his eyes. What he saw, a handsome, well-dressed man. What he didn't see, someone recognizable from the tech columns or investor roundtables. A nobody, Preston decided. "Preston," Marina said, her tone even. The invite was hard to ignore. "You know Brielle, of course." "Of course," Marina said with a nod. Brielle offered a smile, a practiced one that didn't quite reach her ice-bright eyes. "And this is—" Preston gestured vaguely at Ethan. "Ethan Ward," he said, extending his hand. His grip was steady, his stare calm. He said nothing more, no job title, no affiliation. It was intentional. In his world, if you had to explain who you were, you probably weren't that important. Preston interpreted the quiet as a lack of significance. "So what line of work are you in, Ethan?" he asked. "Finance," his default probe to estimate any man's worth in seconds. "In a way," Ethan said vaguely, his gaze drifting toward the ornate ceiling beams. "Stunning venue." Preston puffed his chest. "The Delmore's the best. Only the best for Langford Corp. We're set to smash all our fundraising numbers tonight. It's about growth, you know? Keep building. Always expanding." He shot the last line straight at Marina, a not-so-subtle jab at her scaled-back life. "Some things are perfect just as they are," she replied smoothly. "Growth isn't always about size. Sometimes it's about depth." Preston let out a short, mocking laugh, spoken like a true boutique hobbyist. It landed like a slap. A hobby. He had just dismissed her business, her purpose, as a trivial pastime. Marina's face flushed, but before she could reply, Ethan's hand pressed gently against her back, a silent reassurance. "Preston, it's Mr. Vanderbrook," Brielle said suddenly, tugging on his sleeve and toward a silver-haired mogul holding court nearby. "He wants to discuss the Tahoe expansion." Preston's head snapped around. Business and status eclipsed the satisfaction of tearing into his ex-wife. "Of course. Excuse us." He offered them one last glance, half smug, half dismissive. "Try not to get sticker shock," he said, turning away. "When you see the silent auction items, you'll understand," Preston said. "Though I imagine you're mostly here for the champagne." With that, he steered Brielle away, leaving Marina and Ethan standing amid the murmurs. Marina exhaled slowly, her calm faltering. "I hate that he can still do that," she muttered, her voice strained. "Make me feel small." "He didn't make you feel small," Ethan said, eyes fixed on Preston's retreating frame. "He tried. There's a difference." He paused, then added, "A man who's truly confident in his stature doesn't waste energy trying to shrink others." Ethan gently led her toward the bar. As they passed a knot of sharply dressed guests, Marina caught the edge of a whispered comment. "That's Preston Langford's ex. Can you believe it? She looks ordinary, And who's that with her? He's attractive, but I've never seen him before. Ethan didn't flinch, but his fingers closed slightly tighter around hers for just a second. He had already memorized the report from Michael Tran. Langford Corp was majority owned by a family holding group led by a second-generation board chairman who had been quietly entertaining offers for months. The group wasn't looking for a public battle. They preferred a discreet, all-cash deal from a buyer with discretion and reputation. The valuation was steep, but to Ethan, it was pocket change. As he handed Marina a flute of champagne, he didn't see a social evening. He saw a transaction, a precise move on a chessboard. Preston thought this was his arena, his stage. But in truth, he was just a temporary CEO of a company Ethan was casually considering buying. The irony? Almost poetic. To timeless elegance, Ethan said, raising his glass, his gaze steady and sure, and to the beauty of a very, very simple life. As the evening unfolded, it became a theater of affluence. True to form, Preston made sure the Langford name was the loudest echo in the room. He eventually stepped onto the stage, a spotlight trailing him like a loyal servant. His speech overflowed with self-congratulation, visions of growth, legacy, relentless ambition. To Marina, every word felt targeted. When he spoke of letting go of dead weight to soar, she could feel the glances of people who knew exactly what that was meant to imply. Ethan sat beside her like still water, an anchor amid the churn of egos. Every so often, he tapped a quiet message into his phone, his expression never shifting. Preston's subtle campaign continued even off stage. He would steer influential figures toward their table, introductions sharpened like blades. "Arthur, you've got to meet my ex-wife, Marina," he said to a silver-haired media executive. "She's the creative sort, left finance and the boardroom behind for, well, pottery." He said the last word like it was a diagnosis. Arthur offered a polite smile, brief and distant, his eyes already wandering for someone else more relevant. Each interaction chipped away at her, the kind of precise, practiced cruelty designed not to break her in one blow, but to slowly drain her confidence, one calculated insult at a time. Then came the live auction, Preston's crowning moment. The items were outrageously extravagant. A week on a Mediterranean superyacht, a private dinner prepared by a Michelin-starred celebrity chef, a custom-built, one-of-a-kind electric roadster. Preston played auctioneer himself, theatrically animated, using the spotlight to name-drop and underline his own ostentatious generosity. "Come on, folks," he roared. "It's for the kids," he grinned, "and the Langford Foundation will match the next bid, whatever it is." The final item was a gleaming Grubel Forsey timepiece, strikingly similar to the one Ethan was wearing that night. The bidding escalated fast, climbing into six-figure territory. $150,000, Preston shouted. "An absolute bargain for craftsmanship of this caliber. Do I hear $160? His gaze swept the ballroom and landed right on Marina's table. A cruel, knowing smile tugged at his lips. "You know," he said into the microphone, voice saturated with nostalgia, "there was a time when Marina and I couldn't even afford a knockoff. We used to dream about nights like these." He chuckled. "Just goes to show what ambition can get you." Then, with a wink, "Of course, some of us keep dreaming. Others seem comfortable just browsing." A thick silence spread across the room. The insult hung in the air, pointed, public, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a dig. It was an attack on her past, twisted into evidence of her inadequacy. Preston had cast her as a has-been, an uninvited spectator in the theater of wealth. Marina's skin flushed hot. She could feel every gaze in the room, pity from some, smugness from others. She didn't need to look to know Brielle was beaming across the room. She turned to Ethan. He hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, calm, focused, clinical, like a scientist observing something utterly predictable. Then, silently, Ethan reached for his phone and tapped out one final message, precise and final. That message was the green light. Moments later, the auction resumed. The watch sold for an obscene amount, but it didn't matter. The real damage had already been done. Preston had achieved what he wanted. He had labeled Marina a relic, a thread in a story he had already rewritten. And then came the finale. Preston returned to center stage, basking in applause and artificial light. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, swelling with self-importance, "thanks to your remarkable generosity and a final match from the Langford Foundation, we have raised a record-breaking $15 million tonight. The room exploded with cheers. Confetti cannons erupted, showering the room in glimmering silver streamers. Preston took a deep theatrical bow, basking in the roaring applause. He was the ruler of the room, the sovereign of his world. Lifting his glass, he raised it high. "A final toast," he announced, eyes locking on Marina in the crowd, smug triumph glowing in his stare. "To success." He paused, letting the room hang on his words. "To always pushing forward, always climbing higher. To knowing what you want and never, ever settling for a simple, quiet life when greatness is within reach. To leaving the past exactly where it belongs." Another pause. Then he raised his glass directly toward Marina. In the past, the room cheered, but the toast wasn't just a celebration, it was a public execution. He wasn't just honoring his triumph, he was reveling in his liberation from her, from the life they had built together. Marina felt a chill spread inside her. It was done. He had won. And then something shifted. From the side of the room, a man in a charcoal suit, the general manager of the Delmore, hurried toward the stage. Marina recognized him from previous events. His face was pale, his movements stiff with urgency. He leaned in and whispered something to the event coordinator, who glanced at Preston with wide, alarmed eyes. Preston frowned, displeased with the intrusion. "What is it?" he mouthed. The manager, a man named Mr. Bellamy, stepped toward the microphone like a soldier marching toward a firing squad. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Bellamy began, his voice trembling, "my sincere apologies for this interruption. We have one final announcement to make tonight." A low ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Preston's expression soured. This wasn't in the plan. There weren't supposed to be any more announcements. Mr. Bellamy clutched a folded sheet of paper as though it were a shield. "The Delmore has been a fixture in this city for generations," he said. "Owned and operated by the Covington Family Trust since its founding. However, as of approximately 20 minutes ago," he paused for breath, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. "Controlling interest in the trust, and thereby full ownership of this historic property, has been transferred." A jolt of disbelief shot through the crowd. The Delmore wasn't just a venue, it was an institution. Deals like that didn't happen mid-party on a Tuesday night. Preston's eyes narrowed. "Transferred?" he said aloud, stunned. "To who?" Mr. Bellamy scanned the room. The crowd quieted. His gaze landed on a table near the edge of the ballroom, on the quiet man beside Marina Lowell. "Please join me in congratulating the Delmore's new owner," Mr. Bellamy said, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "Mr. Ethan Ward." For a full 10 seconds, the room was silent. The only sound in the Delmore's great hall was the faint, ghostly echo of Vivaldi from the Forgotten String Quartet. Over 1,500 of Seattle's most powerful and vocal citizens sat in total, breathless silence. The collective intake of air made a soft whooshing sound, like the ocean pulling back before an earthquake. Preston Langford stood frozen on stage, his victory smile still stretched across his face. A grotesque echo of joy that hadn't yet received the memo of its own expiration. His mind stalled, unable to process what had just occurred. He blinked, a slow, reptilian blink. His eyes darted from the trembling face of Mr. Bellamy to the hushed crowd, and then, like a magnet, they found Ethan. Ethan hadn't moved. He wasn't smirking or smug. He simply raised his champagne flute and took a calm sip. His eyes focused not on Preston, but solely on Marina, as if she were the only one that mattered. Marina felt as if the floor had tilted beneath her. Her thoughts scrambled, trying to assemble the puzzle. Ethan's subtle questions about the venue, his calm amidst Preston's taunts, the quiet text messages. It all clicked in a single, thunderous realization. The man she thought of as her safe harbor had just orchestrated a move of such magnitude, such sheer audacity. It made everything Preston had ever done look like child's play. The silence didn't shatter. It unraveled into a ripple of whispered shock. "Ethan Ward? That Ethan Ward? He just bought the Delmore? He's with her? Preston's ex?" The power dynamic in the room didn't shift, it inverted. Violently, suddenly, what had once orbited around Preston's spotlight now revolved around Marina's table. No one was looking at Preston with admiration anymore. They stared at him the way one might watch a building collapse in real time. And they looked at Marina, not as an afterthought, but as the partner of the man who had just bought the very foundation beneath Preston's feet. Preston's face, drained of color, now flushed with a blotchy, furious red. The humiliation was physical, crushing. No slight he had delivered to Marina could match the blow he had just suffered. He had boasted from a stage, only to learn it belonged to the man beside his ex-wife. He had talked legacy, standing in a castle of sand. He stumbled down the stairs, stiff, twitchy. He pushed past a server, nearly spilling a tray of flutes, and stormed toward their table. The crowd made room, silent and bracing. Brielle trailed behind, her face caught between fear and incomprehension. "What is this?" Preston hissed, voice low, sharp with fury. He wasn't addressing the crowd, he was talking directly to Ethan. "What kind of game are you playing?" Ethan finally turned his eyes away from Marina and looked at Preston. His expression wasn't triumphant. It was bored. "No game, Preston." Ethan's voice was even, controlled, which only made Preston's rage burn hotter. "It was just a real estate transaction." "Real estate?" Preston hissed, his volume rising. "You bought the Delmore in the middle of my event. You did this to humiliate me." Ethan calmly set his champagne flute down with surgical precision. He met Preston's stare directly, and for the first time that night, Marina saw something cold and immovable in Ethan's eyes. It was the look of a man who closed billion-dollar deals before breakfast, who bought and dismantled companies without flinching. "Let me make this perfectly clear," Ethan said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper, forcing both Preston and the circling eavesdroppers to lean in. "Your gala, your company, your reputation, played no meaningful role in my decision. You're a footnote, Preston, an irrelevant variable." He paused, letting the words land, slow and sharp. "I acquired this building for one reason, and one reason only." He turned and looked at Marina. The steel in his eyes softened immediately, replaced by something warm, something no less powerful. Everyone, including Preston, followed his gaze. "I was told this place held a painful memory for her," Ethan said. His tone was quieter now, gentler, but devastating in its sincerity. "And tonight, I watched you try to give her another one." A pause. "I don't like when people try to hurt her, so I bought the memory." He glanced at the walls. "Figured we could renovate, change the lighting. Bit harsh in here. Doesn't really suit her." It wasn't revenge, it wasn't competition, it was protection. A reset. A restoration of dignity. The ultimate power move disguised as a simple act of love. Preston stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound, like a fish out of water. The audience stared, stunned and silent. In an instant, every ounce of swagger was gone. What was left was a man unmasked, small, exposed, and irrelevant. Marina glanced between the two men, the man who had tried to define her worth, and the one who had never questioned it. And in that instant, every last trace of pain, every ghost that had lingered from her past with Preston, vanished. She wasn't just vindicated, she was seen, she was protected, she was loved, on a scale she had never imagined possible. Marina reached out, her hand finding Ethan's. He intertwined his fingers with hers, a quiet certainty in his touch. "I think," she said softly, her voice clear and grounded in the still hushed ballroom, "I've had enough champagne for one night. Shall we go home?" "Of course," Ethan replied. He rose, pulling out her chair with an effortless, old-world grace, so simple, so natural, and in that moment, the most commanding gesture in the room. They turned and walked away, leaving Preston Langford standing stranded at the center of the grand hall, a relic inside a museum that no longer displayed his name. As Marina and Ethan moved, the room responded. Like iron filings drawn to a new magnetic field, the entire hall shifted. Those once fixated on Preston now twisted, angled, pivoted towards something stronger, more relevant. "Marina, darling, you look absolutely radiant." It was Beatrice Winthrop, a society doyenne who just hours earlier had offered Marina only cool dismissal. Now her voice oozed adoration. "We must lunch next week at the club." Mr. Ward, brilliant acquisition, truly. That came from a hedge fund executive who'd once tried to recruit one of Preston's senior VPs. His tone now brimmed with urgent admiration. A bold stroke in a stagnating sector. Inspired. They buzzed like moths, newly aware of the brightest flame in the room. Marina felt Ethan's hand steady at the small of her back, firm, guiding, unbothered by the crowd pressing in. He nodded once, expression unreadable, pace unhurried. He moved like a warship among sailboats, acknowledging their presence, but utterly unaffected. Marina kept her eyes on the exit, her lungs aching for cool night air. away from this suffocating rush of forced smiles and redirected loyalties. Behind them, Preston stood abandoned, marooned in a spotlight that now felt like an interrogation lamp. The confetti, once celebratory at his feet, now looked like the glittering debris of a party gone wrong. He watched the crowd orbit Marina and Ethan, his ex-wife and the man who'd rewritten his narrative without raising his voice, and fury bubbled through the fog of his disbelief. Beside him, Brielle Ashton was conducting her own private audit. Her face, once a gleaming portrait of confidence, had begun to twitch with visible doubt. The Langford brand, once a sure bet, now looked like a sinking stock. The man beside her no longer resembled a mogul. He looked like a cautionary tale. She blinked, recalibrating, and then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, her hand slipped from Preston's arm, because now, being close to him felt dangerous. The final, decisive blow didn't come from the crowd. It came from its apex. Arthur Kingsley, the silver-maned media titan whose approval Preston had chased for years, strolled over. He wasn't smiling. He took in the scene with the same detached interest a scientist might give to a failed experiment. Stopping just short of Preston, he sipped his whiskey and spoke in a low, graveled voice, somehow more damning than any shout. "Langford," he said, his tone coated in disappointment. "A word of advice, from an old man. This city is a jungle. Beautiful, dazzling, brutal. And when you move through it, you better know damn well who the apex predator is before you start pounding your chest." He lifted his glass subtly in the direction of Ethan's retreating back. "You just tried to outroar a lion, and you didn't even know he was in the grass." He took another sip, then delivered the final blow. "Disastrous. Bad for your brand." Kingsley didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked off, leaving Preston alone. Utterly alone. The word brand echoed like a siren in Preston's skull. It was all he truly cared about, the identity he'd constructed, the empire he believed invulnerable. And Kingsley had just declared it irrelevant. That broke him. The cold shock of embarrassment cracked, giving way to a boiling, directionless rage. This wasn't just defeat. It was erasure. And Preston Langford wouldn't allow it. He surged forward, storming across the ballroom, no longer staggering but propelled by raw adrenaline. He shoved past startled guests and burst into a near sprint, catching up to them in the marble foyer. The acoustics amplified his fury, his footsteps like cannon fire. "You," he growled. His voice roared through the stone hall. He lunged forward and grabbed Ethan's arm. Ethan stopped. He didn't react with shock or panic. He just turned and looked down at Preston's hand gripping the sleeve of his Tom Ford suit. He stared at it the way one might stare at something unclean, a slug, unwelcome and clinging. Preston flinched instinctively and yanked his hand back as if burned. Two of Ethan's security detail, silent until now, stepped forward. Not loud, not threatening, just present. A quiet wall of consequence. There would be no more public drama, no audience left for tantrums. "This was a cheap stunt, Ward." Preston spat, his face twisted in fury. "A back-alley ambush. You think you're better than me? You think money means you can buy your way through anything?" Ethan turned to face him fully now. His expression was clinical, unbothered, flat as glass. "It's interesting," Ethan said, voice low. "Calm, that's how you see it. You, who spent an entire night equating generosity with wire transfers. You, who measures every person by the size of their portfolio. You don't live in a world, Preston. You live in a marketplace. And in a marketplace, everything has a price." He let that sit. "I just happen to have enough liquidity to buy your stage, your props, and your ego." A pause. "Though if I'm being honest," his voice grew even quieter, "they were all wildly overvalued." That final methodical blow, delivered with the precision of a scalpel, pushed Preston to the brink. "This isn't about me," Preston snapped, his voice ragged. "This is about her." He jabbed a trembling finger at Marina. "This is what you do now? You upgrade? Trade in for a bigger wallet? All that talk about living a simple life, was that just a story? You left me to go play with flowers and clay in some artsy loft, but that was just a waiting room until you could reel in a bigger whale?" He gestured wildly toward Ethan. "You call this simple?" It was his final desperate move, a last poisoned dart aimed at Marina's integrity, a bid to paint her as disingenuous, opportunistic. But it wasn't Ethan who responded. It was Marina. She stepped forward, quietly inserting herself between the two men. And when she looked at Preston, really looked, she didn't see power. or stature, or even anger. She saw fear, a hollow, shrinking man who had built his identity on applause, and all she felt was a profound, aching pity. "You still don't understand, do you, Preston?" she said. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "You never did. The simple life I wanted was never about poverty. It was about being rich in things you don't know how to measure." She inhaled slowly, eyes steady. "I remember our 5th anniversary. You had just wrapped the Cinex Telecom merger. You handed me a diamond bracelet worth more than some condos. And an hour later, when I tried to tell you about the novel I was reading, you checked your stock app 3 times while I was speaking. You gave me diamonds, but you couldn't give me 5 minutes of attention. That bracelet wasn't a gift. It was an apology, and everything you've ever bought has been an apology for something missing." She turned her gaze briefly to Ethan, a silent exchange passing between them, full of warmth and gravity, before fixing her attention back on Preston. "Ethan didn't do this to impress me. He did it because I once told him weeks ago that this place held a painful memory. He remembered. And tonight, when he saw you trying to layer another painful memory on top of it, he took the weapon out of your hands. This wasn't a power play. It was an act of listening. That's the difference between you. You use money to shout, so you never have to hear anyone else. He uses his," Marina said quietly, "to create a space quiet enough to listen. That's a language you'll never understand." Her words didn't strike Preston. They dismantled him. She had taken him apart with calm, surgical clarity, revealed the hollowness beneath his performance. There was no comeback, no clever retort, just silence. Preston stood frozen, mouth slightly open, the heat of rage draining from his face and leaving behind only a pale, crumbling vacancy. Marina turned to Ethan and lightly took his arm. "Let's go." They walked together through the towering bronze doors, held open by a silent member of Ethan's staff. Outside, the air was cool and damp, Seattle's fog curling around them like a breath from the earth itself. And behind them, Preston Langford remained in the marble foyer. Alone, abandoned in the building that now embodied the full collapse of his carefully constructed empire. The car door closed with a soft final click. As the sedan pulled smoothly into the night, Marina let out a long, unsteady exhale. Her composure cracked. The mask dropped. She trembled. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the night. I don't even have words." He didn't ask for details. He never needed to. "Are you all right?" was all he said. All his attention, always, was on her. "I am now." A tear slipped down her cheek, hot, unexpected, heavy with everything. Relief, shock, release, gratitude. He reached out and brushed it away with the pad of his thumb, a quiet, grounding touch in the cocoon dark of the car. "It was the most direct solution," he said simply. "He was being a bully. I don't tolerate bullies." He paused, a slight smile tugging at one corner of his mouth as he glanced out the window. "Besides," he added, voice shifting into that calm, dry reason that was so purely him, "David Chen assures me it's a sound investment. The zoning permits alone are worth a fortune." She laughed. Really laughed, a fragile, tear-wet sound that cut through the emotional fog. Only Ethan could say something like that right after buying a landmark in an act of sweeping, cinematic romance. Zoning permits, of course, and yet it didn't make it less romantic. It made it him. It rooted everything, his actions, his motives, his love, in bedrock. In reality, he hadn't done it for show. He had done it for her. That made all the difference. They didn't go back to Ethan's penthouse loft. Instead, the car glided north, silent as a dream, slipping through the sleeping city. Marina sat back, watching the streetlights flicker past, each one a small, fleeting star in the soft galaxy of the city night. The chaos of the gala felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The shouting, the stares, the tension, it was all dulled now, sealed away behind the soundproofed glass of the sedan. Inside the car, only stillness remained. And in that quiet, the enormity of what had just occurred began to settle. Not like a triumph, but like a seismic shift under Marina's feet. She had run from Preston's world of suffocating opulence, only to find herself aligned with a force so much greater. Preston's empire now seemed like a piggy bank. And with that realization came something new. Not fear of Ethan, but of something larger, something harder to define. The car descended into a private garage. The gate side closed behind them, severing their connection to the outside world entirely. A private elevator, sleek brushed steel and soft amber lighting, whisked them upward in silence. When the doors opened, there was no hallway, no transition. They stepped directly into what could only be described as a piece of the sky. It wasn't an apartment. It was a floating world. A triplex penthouse perched above Manhattan, suspended in light. The main wall soared upward in glass, a seamless portal to the night. Central Park, a dark river below, ringed by constellations of city lights. The space was enormous, but far from sterile. A grand piano gleamed in one corner. Books lined a wall-spanning library, worn spines and loose pages hinting at hours spent, not just shelves styled for effect. Furniture, Eames, Saarinen, Noguchi, was placed in clusters that spoke of conversation, not display. It was a space designed for reflection, for someone who wielded global influence and came home to silence. Ethan didn't turn on the lights. The city was light enough. He led her to a deep sofa, angled toward the view, and poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal carafe. The clink of glass was the only sound. "This is where you live?" Marina asked finally, her voice no more than a breath. He nodded, settling onto the couch beside her, close, but not too close. "It's quiet," he said. "The height keeps most of the noise out." She studied him, this man of contradictions, quiet and unstoppable, warm and utterly unreadable. "Ethan," she began, voice trembling just a little, "I don't know what to feel. I'm grateful, more than I can say. You defended me, in a way no one ever has. But I have to be honest, I'm also scared." His brows creased with concern. "Scared of Preston?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Of this." She gestured around them, at the view, at the impossible luxury, at the scale of power he had wielded like it was nothing. "It's not just the money," she continued, her voice quieter now but firmer. "It's what it represents. The control, the access, the way rooms open for you without you even touching the door. I remember what it felt like being with Preston, always unsure if people liked me or just tolerated me because I came with him. And for a moment tonight, I felt that again. I saw people staring at us, whispering, recalculating their opinions like I was a number on your spreadsheet." She paused, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. "I spent so long trying to build a life that was small enough to be mine, something I could carry, shape, understand. And tonight, just for a moment, I felt like I was disappearing again, into someone else's life, someone else's gravity. This feels like Preston's world," she said, "just with more zeros. I left him because I was drowning in a gilded cage. I'm afraid," she paused, her voice barely audible now, "I've just been handed the key to a larger, more beautiful one." And finally, she looked at him. Really looked, her eyes shining. With tears that hadn't yet fallen, Marina's voice trembled. "I chose a small life, Ethan. A simple one. I built it with my own hands. I was proud of it. And tonight, with just one phone call, you made it feel like it didn't matter. You bought a building to solve a problem. It was, yes, it was extraordinary, I know that. But it was also," she looked down at her hands, "a display of power so massive it makes everything I've done feel like background noise. I don't want to be the woman whose CEO boyfriend buys buildings for her. I want to be Marina Lowell, the artist who owns a quiet studio in the village. Can I still be her with you?" He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He listened, truly listened. Every word sinking into him, visible in the stillness of his body, the intensity of his gaze. When she finished, there was a pause, a long, deliberate silence, not one of dismissal but of measured thought. "I understand," he said at last. His voice was low, quiet. "And you're right to feel this way, to be cautious. You should be. Because somewhere in that fear," he continued, "is something beautiful. It means you still believe in boundaries, in lines you drew for yourself, and you're not ready to blur them, even for someone like me." He exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "That matters, Marina. That integrity matters. The world doesn't need another person who folds in the face of power. It needs people like you, who question it. But I need you to see where I'm coming from." He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "It's not the view of a rich man, it's the mind of an engineer. I see the world as a series of systems, interconnected, some elegant, some barely holding together. Preston," he said, his voice dry, "he is a system, a fragile one. He runs on public admiration, he's powered by the envy of others, but he has one fatal weakness. humiliation, and tonight, he tried to make you that weak point. He brought his system of loud validation to tear down your system of quiet authenticity. He looked at her. There's no arguing with that kind of system. You can't fix it. You can't reason with it. You can only do one thing: expose the flaw. And the flaw is his obsession with wealth as identity. So I played his game, one he didn't even understand he was losing. The building? It wasn't about money. It was code, Marina. A line of code executed to solve the problem, to get you out from under the weight of his system. He let the words land, each like a carefully placed circuit, and then he softened, shifted. His voice grew quieter, warmer. The money, it's a byproduct, an ugly one most days. It came from a system I built long ago, and yes, it works, but it's not who I am. It's a tool I use to create space, to create silence, so I can think, so I can build. His voice dropped to a whisper now, as he inched a little closer. And now, so I can protect the things I value. He met her eyes fully, and held them. And I value you. I value your simple life, more than anything in this room, more than my company, more than all of it. Do you know why? Ethan said, his voice quiet but unwavering. Because it's real. Your life, it isn't a system, it's an art form. I've watched you work in your studio, clay on your hands, that little streak of dirt across your cheek, and I see something so rare. A kind of focus, a kind of purity. You create like I solve when I'm deep in code or rebuilding a failing system. You're not just making things, Marina, you're making meaning. My world is full of people who take. You're one of the few people I've ever met who truly creates. He reached out, gently cupping her jaw in his palm. I'm not trying to absorb your world into mine. I'm hoping, he paused, you'll let me visit yours. I don't want to change your life. I want to join it. And I'll use whatever tools I have, whether it's a quiet word, a helping hand, or, if it comes to it, every cent of my fortune, to make sure nothing and no one ever makes you question the worth of what you've built. Something shifted then, something final. Marina looked into his eyes, and all the fear, all the uncertainty that had been tightening in her chest since the gala melted away. This wasn't another Preston. This was the opposite. Preston had used his wealth to trap her, to make her another line item in his empire. Ethan used his to break every wall that tried to contain her. She leaned forward, closing the final distance between them, and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was deeper. It was a kiss of understanding, of gratitude, of recognition. A kiss that said, I see you, and you see me too. It was a love that didn't seek to possess. It only sought to protect. A few weeks later, an article ran in Architectural Digest. It outlined the stunning off-market acquisition of the atrium by the elusive tech visionary Ethan Ward. It spoke of a sweeping transformation, the removal of gaudy chandeliers, the overwrought gilded ornamentation, all of it stripped away in favor of natural materials, minimalist geometry, and, above all else, light. But it was the final paragraphs that sent ripples through New York's upper echelons. The new Grand Hall, they said, would not be anchored by some oversized sculpture or garish statement piece. Instead, Ethan Ward had commissioned a series of large-scale ceramic installations, custom-designed, integrated with cascading vertical gardens that would turn the walls into living art. And the artist? A reclusive ceramist, known for her organic forms, tactile glazes, and devotion to quiet craftsmanship. She worked from a small by-appointment studio tucked away in the village. Her name? Marina Lowell. Her simple, understated work was now the soul of Manhattan's newest cultural landmark. Across town, in a glass office that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, Preston Langford let the magazine slip from his hands. His phones were quieter now, and no one was calling for him. These days, the board had summoned a special meeting to address the recent volatility surrounding Preston Langford's public profile. Tiffany was long gone, her exit as swift and impersonal as a market crash, leaving behind nothing but the faint imprint of her presence on the other side of his bed. He sat alone in his penthouse office, holding the latest Architectural Digest, staring at the glossy rendering of the new atrium. At the centerpiece was a towering installation of minimalist ceramic sculptures, Marina's work, organic, serene, commanding. It wasn't just a venue he had lost. It wasn't just a woman. He had lost the entire argument. He had misunderstood, fundamentally, the nature of value. He had laughed at her simple life, blind to the fact that she had been quietly building an empire of her own, not of capital, but of meaning. And now he was forever on the outside, watching, living what might be the poorest life of all. In the end, it was never about money. It was about worth. Preston Langford believed worth was tied to balance sheets and applause. But Marina Lowell and Ethan Ward had shown the world another truth, that real worth lives in authenticity, in choosing peace over pretense, in protecting what you love, and in building a life, no matter how modest, that is entirely your own. The grandest gesture hadn't been buying the atrium. It had been placing her art at its core, a permanent monument to the quiet strength she embodied, a living, breathing declaration that her passion, her life, had more value than all his loud ambition combined. Because real power doesn't perform. It protects, and it proves, without ever needing to shout. So the story is over, our wonderful friends. Are you still here at this hour? If you are, then something in Marina and Ethan's journey touched a part of your heart. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when you were underestimated, or when you had to choose between noise and peace, between being seen and being consumed. This story wasn't just about wealth or status, it was about worth. It's a quiet reminder that the truest form of strength often lies not in how loudly you fight, but in how deeply you stand for what matters. Marina's simple life wasn't small, it was intentional. And Ethan, in the most quiet and commanding way, used his resources not to overpower but to protect. In a world that screams for validation, this story whispers truth. Remember what Ethan said, real power doesn't perform, it protects. And as the philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. We are not what we own. We are what we build, what we love, protect, and nurture. So if you're still here, I want to invite you. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who might need to be reminded that quiet lives can carry immense value. And if stories like these speak to your soul, subscribe to our channel. This isn't just storytelling, it's healing. Until next time, take care of your quiet life. Because sometimes it's the quietest ones who leave the loudest legacy.